Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thanks again for coming this evening. We have a really great attendance of individuals, and especially of the 4 county chapters, Pitt, Montgomery, Mecklenburg, and then our host chapter, the Chatham County Beekeepers. So shout out to all of you guys who are watching as a group, and again, thank you for attending as a group. But also for those of you that are joining individually, I think this is really great that we're all able to come together, not just within the state of North Carolina, but outside of North Carolina as well. So this webinar platform is a great way to get together virtually and discuss really interesting topics concerning bees and beekeeping. So Chatham County, thanks again for hosting, and we've been working towards this. I think they've booked this a good year or so ago, and they came up with, I thought, was a really brilliant idea of a very timely topic for the month of January. So most of us in the northern hemisphere, in the northern climates, January is a pretty slow time when it comes to beekeeping, but it's an incredibly busy time when it comes to bee schools, right, and beekeeper education. And so this is a great time for a lot of people who are on the fence or who have kind of committed over the winter months to commit to start keeping bees the following spring. And so to capitalize on that, every year, a lot of the beekeeping clubs, especially here in North Carolina, there are dozens and dozens of really excellent bee schools all across the state, have these beekeeping short courses where they are trying to get people up and running so that they can start their first hive of bees this spring. And so in conjunction with those various efforts, which range widely from just a single day to 10 weeks at 2 hours every week type of courses, they thought, the Chatham County group thought it would be really good to have kind of a higher level discussion of not what should go into a bee school per se, but what all of the bee schools should be addressing in kind of a meta approach when it comes to aspiring beekeepers and would-be beekeepers. And I thought that was a really interesting discussion point that we can all pitch in and learn from each other with regards to this. So the idea that I had here was that I will just get the ball rolling on this discussion with a couple of ideas that I had as far as some of the key things that I think aspiring beekeepers really know to help them get started this upcoming spring. But I'm sure you guys have a whole lot of ideas as well, and so I want a lot of good back and forth and for other people to chime in. So before we get to those different topics, I do want to start with a couple of brief announcements and some upcoming events. This has been a really, really sad start to the 2015 calendar year, as many of you in the North Carolina State Beekeepers Association know, and the North Carolina beekeeping community. We had the untimely passing of my predecessor, John Ambrose, who ran the NC State Apiculture program for about 30 years. And he just passed away very early this year, 1 week into his presidency of the NCSBA. And so it was unexpected. He had been having some health problems, but it didn't seem like those were gonna stop him, and he unfortunately passed away. This has been making a lot of news and a lot of discussions and fond memories of him throughout the NCSBA community. And so tomorrow is actually going to be a memorial service here on NC State campus, on the Centennial campus of NC State. And so that's something for those in the Triangle area that you very well may want to attend. It's obviously a very somber affair, and it's unfortunate of his passing. He's really going to be sadly missed. That said, there's also the annual, or the biannual joint conference of the NCSBA. Every other year it is hosted jointly with the South Carolina Beekeepers. And so this year, North Carolina, the NCSBA is hosting it in Monroe, North Carolina. And this typically is a really, because it's both state associations coming together for their spring meeting, it's typically very well attended. And they really have a great line of speakers coming up. The date is about a month earlier than the traditional date. There's lots of logistical reasons for that, but so be sure to make sure that it's February 5th through 7th and not the first week in March, as it often has been in the past. So be sure to attend that. Again, they have a really great lineup of speakers that I encourage you to attend. And then finally, here at NC State, you know that we've been engaged in this distance education platform using the Beekeeper Education and Engagement System, or the BEES network. This is something that we've been offering for 3 years. It has kind of online mini courses that you can take either as an individual or a group. So we're really trying to kind of push the envelope when it comes to extension delivery and education delivery. It's been so successful that our extension administration got rid of the server that housed the courses. But not to be deterred, we've migrated all of those courses now over to another server, which is housed by Delta, which is our distance education learning technology group that does all of our 4-credit distance education classes. And so they're now hosting these non-credit courses as well. And so we're kind of developing a new relationship there to see what the future of the BEES network is going to be. So as of right now, these courses are still live and offered. Enrollment is not as seamless as it had been in months past and years past, but we still do have them offered, and hopefully will for the forthcoming future. So with that, the topic at hand is, what aspiring beekeepers, need to know about beekeeping. And, I thought long and hard about this, and the half-life of a new beekeeper is pretty short. I think a lot of beekeepers who have been involved in these bee schools or been involved in local clubs, they see new beekeepers coming in, and a lot of them quit just after 1 year. And so one of the things that I think a lot of bee schools and a lot of bee clubs and us in the beekeeping community really need to think about is, well, what can we do to kind of, deter them or ease their ability to, stick with it. And one of the things that I've been told by new beekeepers and those that, kind of have quit, very early on, is that they felt like they never was able to understand the bees. That they didn't get it. They went to the bee school and they started up their hives. They read all these books, but in the end, there were all these things that they didn't learn about, and so they felt like they never could wrap their heads around beekeeping at all. And so to assuage any fears of new beekeepers that may be in the audience, and I think a common theme that ought to be communicated in a lot of the bee schools that are given is that as a beekeeper, you will never ever learn everything about bees and beekeeping. So don't even try, right? Don't worry that you won't know everything. I think there's something where you feel like you fail because you haven't been able to learn everything. And for those of us that have been keeping bees for many years, you realize that it really is true that the more you know, the less you understand. And bees, I think, epitomize this, right? We've been working with bees for tens of thousands of years, right? I mean, our association as humans with honeybees has been going on since, the dawn of time. And we still have a lot to learn about bees. We've learned a lot, but there's still so much about the bees that are a mystery to us. And frankly, I think that that's part of their allure. That's part of why we find them so fascinating, right? So if a new beekeeper, an aspiring beekeeper, is going into this thinking that they're going to learn it and, you know, that's it, don't be deterred by the fact that you'll never get there, right? It's a mountain that you just simply, you know, can't peak. That said, don't think that, knowledge is power, and so you really do have to, learn a lot, but it's just an insatiable well that you can keep going to time after time, and you'll just never, it'll be a never-ending source of amazement and fun to learn more and more about the bees. But if you think that there's a very quick end point, that's when I think some beekeepers can get deterred from and then just kind of give up because they think that they'll never end up getting it. The other point that I've heard from a lot of beekeepers that is similar to this is that, they ask one beekeeper a question and they get an answer. And then they ask another beekeeper the same question and they get a different answer. And so they think, well, nobody knows anything. There is no one answer, and therefore it's too complicated. Now, I could probably hear many of you chuckling. That is a standard joke in beekeeping, is that you ask 5 beekeepers the same question, you get 10 answers, right? We all know this. And while tongue-in-cheek, yes, it really is true in the sense that oftentimes there really is more than one answer to a single question. Honeybees are complex, and there are many different ways that you can do things, right? There are many different mousetraps. There are many different ways to skin the same cat when it comes to beekeeping. So the fact that there are multiple answers doesn't mean that, it's too complicated, but, that there are just different approaches to it, right? So I think don't fret when it comes to realizing that there's this kind of daunting amount of information and you're never going to learn it all. Don't worry, you never will. But don't let that deter you. Just go with it and realize that there's always something that you can learn more when it comes to bees. Does anybody else have anything to say concerning that? This idea that there's just so much to know about bees and beekeeping that we shouldn't be afraid that we're not going to ever be able to learn everything. Louis, go ahead.
I think my favorite part of beekeeping is the lifelong learning. I mean, I know that, I guess my second year of beekeeping, I felt like I knew everything. And then as I began to learn, the more I learned, the more I understood how much I did not know. And that's what has really kept me involved and keeps me excited about beekeeping. So I encourage new folks to not, certainly don't feel like that you're going to go through bee school and then you're fully armed and prepared for everything. It's really a lifelong learning thing, and so that has to be something that you're interested in. If you're looking for a quick fix, this might not be your thing. But if you're looking for a long haul, lifelong learning opportunity, this is a great one.
Well, that said, I think you also don't want to confuse that with that. To take on beekeeping, it's a lifelong commitment, right? Like I don't think you get out of it what you put into it, right? So you don't have to, you don't have to do it for the rest of your life, or you don't have to continuously, learn things. You do learn enough in that first year to be able to, to get by. It's just that if one goes in with the perception that yeah, you just have to know, 10 steps and then that's it, yeah, it is a lot more to it, and there's a lot of layers to the onion that we shouldn't be afraid about. But I can't agree with you more that that's the thing that is really great about bees and beekeeping, is that it's just an endless, you know, supply of information and fascination that we can always be learning. There was somebody in Montgomery who was asking about year-round use of screen bottom boards, and what about screen bottom boards? I think we might want to leave kind of specific questions off of this subject to maybe perhaps after the webinar. Right now we're talking about kind of a general issue about you know, what aspiring beekeepers, you know, really need to know. But things that are dealing with actual beekeeping management practices is something maybe we can address at the end, if that's okay. But is there anything else that anybody would like to chime in on here? Oh, Bob, you have your hand up? I think, Bob, you might have a slow connection there, so it's coming through a bit muddled. So, yeah, I'm sorry. You might want to type it in instead. Let me see if I can do something about your microphone there. My apologies. So if Bob or anybody else wants to, nope. Yeah, that was a different. So here's another comment: the bees are not something you can just set it and forget about. I think that's a good point about setting them up and then not worrying about it. Right? That was how it used to be, but they do require attention. They don't, and it depends on the time of year, right? Right? They don't require daily attention, you know, but certain times of year they require perhaps weekly attention. Other times, you know, every month that you have to go in. So if you're just in it, you know, for the honey and, you know, don't expect to have that type of attention, then yeah, it can be discouraging in the sense that it's not a fire and forget type of thing. That is a very good point. Another point here, Jim said that as with every discipline, learning the language is one of the most important hurdles. And yeah, that's a good way to put it. I like that analogy. It's like learning a language, right? You're learning the bee's language, but it's not kind of a language per se, but it's trying to understand their system and their biology and how they function and your relationship with them. And so yeah, it does take an assimilation, which just takes time, right? One other question here from, here, this is very appropriate. Bees don't read the book, right? So that's a good point. That should have been a separate topic itself. We have all sorts of information, you know, all these things in bee schools, and you know, this is what it says in the book. And then you go out into the hive, and you'll realize, well, you know, that's an exception to the rule. That's an exception to rule, and it's almost like there's more exceptions to the rule than all the rules that we've learned. But that just shows how much variability and variation there is in the bees. That yeah, the bees don't read the book, and they often do things that you did not learn that they were supposed to do. Debbie had the question for the Chatham group. They're interested about hearing how other counties mentor new beekeepers. They have organized formal programs or do it informally. That's a great question. In fact, can we address that at the end? Because I've had some thoughts about this, about how the Bees Network specifically might be able to assist in that. We did a train-the-trainer type of workshop at the Eastern Apicultural Society 2 years ago, where we were having lots of discussions among those who are conducting bee schools and leaders in their local clubs, and that was the universal question, and the difficulty is having good mentoring programs and what really can be done to foster those. And so let's leave that to the end, because I think that is really, truly critical. So Bob typed in here, again, sorry for your mic issues there, but two thoughts were that beekeeping is an art, not a science. I agree in the sense that it's never one or the other anyway. It's always a combination of those two. But it is very much more of an art than it is a science. And then after getting 10 answers to those 5 questions, really it's up to you to choose which one of those answers is most appropriate for your bee yard. Can't agree with you more on that, in the sense that beekeeping is very individualized, and we are, as beekeepers, are kind of projecting our own values, and the way that we want to keep bees is our decision. And so the bees reflect us. And so what works for one beekeeper may not work for another beekeeper, because you have different disciplines, you have different ways of viewing the world and the ways you want to come at beekeeping. So you're right that a lot of the source for those 10 answers from the 5 beekeepers can stem from the fact that beekeepers do things in very different ways sometimes. So Jamie typed something in here that a very experienced beekeeper suggests that for new beekeepers, sit beside their hives and just watch a while. Yes, they will learn a lot by just watching their own bees. And in fact, that is very sagely advice, and it's something that I do to every incoming graduate student in the entomology department at the North Carolina State University. Every summer, the week before classes begin, we have a single week course where all incoming graduate students go up to the mountains, and they take this very short field ecology course where they get to do lots of different field activities and meet a lot of the faculty and interact with them, kind of doing short exercises. The exercise that I always do is I bring up an observation hive and I say, sit and watch these bees for 4 hours, and then describe some of the how they're interacting and come up with ideas why they're doing that and what they're doing. I can't agree with you more that just sitting and watching the bees do what bees do gives us a huge appreciation for how they actually function. So Randall, you have your hand up?
Yeah, that just kind of put me in mind of how, like Aristotle and Virgil and Ovid, were great observers of the bees, and they learned from the bees. Of course, a lot of what they deduced we know now isn't right. It was either Virgil or Ovid that thought that pollen in the pollen baskets were little pebbles that the bees were carrying so that they could maintain the proper orientation and flight. So it's kind of like, that just kind of points out the observation is incredibly important, and the book learning behind that is very important too.
Yeah.
So.
No, exactly. And it gives us an appreciation of it. And it also, I think, evokes that patience that you have to have as a beekeeper. So that's another good thing, a good lesson from that. That observing them will kind of also kind of force us into that Zen-like state that you have to be in to be an effective beekeeper. So I'll try and come back to some of these other questions in a bit, but just for the sake of time, let's go. I'm going to move on to the second piece of information that I think is very critical for all aspiring beekeepers. And again, I'm totally biased on this because I'm a university professor in the biological sciences, but I'm a staunch believer that as an aspiring beekeeper, you've got to know the biology of the bees. I've seen so many new beekeepers fail because they pick up a book, and that book tells them This is how you set up the box. This is how you put the bees in it. This is what you do at the various times of year. And they follow that to a T, and then everything just falls apart. And why does everything fall apart? It's because, again, the variance of the bees, it's so complicated a system that just knowing the things to do and when you're supposed to do it, again, bees don't read the textbook, as somebody mentioned, so that you can keep bees, sure, by knowing what to do. But the only way to actually be a master beekeeper is to know what the bees want to do naturally. And the only way to do that is to understand their biology, what drives them, how they function together as a unit, the different components, and then how those different components fit together. And so if you go into it, realizing that all beekeepers are really backyard biologists, then that's going to help a lot. And so, all of the best beekeepers that I know are fantastic biologists. They know their bees inside and out. And so that improves your beekeeping ability by knowing the bees themselves. I always use the analogy that, anybody can cook a good meal by following the recipe. But the only way that you can be a master chef is to understand how all the different flavor elements come together, and how to properly cook a piece of meat, and all of those different things come together. That's, again, the art of beekeeping, and the art of culinary science, rather than just the science of it, right? So you need to know both of those things going into it in order to really get an appreciation for that. And I think that really improves everybody's ability to keep bees. So one of the things that I've always noticed in a lot of bee schools, not necessarily across North Carolina, but a lot of the kind of published syllabi that I see, is that it's far too heavy on, how to build a hive than it is about the biology of the bees. That we really need to be talking more about the biology than, or at least equal representation about, what the bees are doing, as well as what we need to do with them in order to make them successful. Does anybody have any other points about that? Hopefully I'm not a minority of one here. Lewis, go ahead.
Understanding the biology of the honeybee is important, but you have to, I think, also add to that the biology of the Varroa mite. When you're managing a colony of bees, you will also inevitably be managing a colony of Varroa mites, and understanding the biology of the mite and how that host-parasite relationship works I think, is going to make the difference between having a good beekeeping experience and a bad beekeeping experience.
Hear, hear. I'm going to applaud that. In fact, we'll be talking about Varroa in another slide here. But, you're right. It's not just about the biology of bees, although it is the biology of the bees, in the sense that, the bees have parasites and they have, problems. So understanding that aspect of their biology is important. And the Varroa mite is such a major management issue when it comes to bees that, it's also oftentimes just swept up with all diseases when people are talking about it in beginner bee schools, but it really does need to be front and center, and perhaps we can talk about that a little more in another point. It might even be the next slide here. Jim notes that could one recommend a book on bee biology? Gosh, there's so many out there, right? That it's hard to say, one over the other. The one that we tend to use in a lot of our classes is Dewey Caron's the biology and honeybee biology and beekeeping. That has a really great balance between the two. And so that's one that I really think is very robust. Beekeeping for Dummies was suggested, but I see the smiley face, so I'm hoping that was suggested in jest. Nothing against that book. I think it's a really great book, especially if you're going to take up beekeeping in a vacuum. But the amount of biology in that is pretty paltry. It's really great to, walk through the how, but it doesn't really talk about the why. And so we really need to understand that why part, and that why part is contingent on the biology. But there are lots of other really great honeybee biology books out there. There was one written by a German scientist, Jürgen Tautz, called The Superorganism. Just fantastic pictures, just really excellent treatise on just the biology of the bees. Really not a whole lot of beekeeping in there at all, but really a lot of a lot of really excellent biology that's in there. Debbie asks, are you saying the first one or the last one? So the two that I mentioned was Dewey Karen's Honeybee Biology and Beekeeping, as well as Jürgen Tautz's The Superorganism. There's also the ABC and XYZ of Bee Culture. Yeah, that's a really good, it's encyclopedic approach in that way, and it really does cover a lot of the different aspects of biology. That's true. It's not tied together in a traditional textbook format where it's synthetic, but it's broken down by subject, so it's a really great resource if you need to address those different subjects individually. So yeah, absolutely. No shortage of books out there, obviously, and I'm sure I'm missing a whole lot just off the top of my head. But there's lots of really good books out there. So, but I tend to gravitate towards the ones that really do tend to emphasize the biology more than some of the others. So here's a third adage to aspiring beekeepers and new beekeepers is to not, again, don't fret so much, in the sense that things can go wrong in beekeeping, and we all know that that's the case. But that doesn't mean that you did something wrong. I think that, first-year beekeepers, if their colony fails, they get really disheveled, or sometimes they can get really, really disheveled and just blame themselves. I don't know what I'm doing, and they all died, and oh boy, I'm just never going to get it. Just realizing that as beekeepers, there's only so much that we can do, and you can do everything right, and still things can go horribly wrong, right? So just realizing that the honeybee colony is incredibly complex, if not infinitely complex. I mean, again, that's one of the wonders of keeping bees, is that it's just this fascinating, complex superorganism of tens of thousands of bees working together as one, and it's just really amazingly complex. And so things can go off the rails, fairly easily, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you did something or you didn't do something that you were supposed to. So things can go wrong even if you were doing everything right. And so I think that's kind of a reassuring message for beekeepers, is just say, don't worry. Everybody who's kept bees has lost honeybee colonies, and that is an unfortunate part of the reality of beekeeping. The average over the last 6 years since the Bee Informed Partnership has been doing these surveys of beekeepers is that the average beekeeper has lost 30% of their bees every year. So that's the norm. Which means pretty much all beekeepers, are losing a certain percentage of their bees. Now, that is unacceptably too high, obviously. There's lots of things that go into it. So the aim is not to accept these losses. We don't want colony mortality, but we want to minimize it. And but we also need to recognize that if if bees do die off, learn from of what happened and try to avoid that same scenario the next time. So you know, don't worry, that new beekeepers should be prepared for that, and that it's not, you know, the end, or it's not a sign that you should give up necessarily. Does everybody agree with that, or do you think that that's poor advice? Does everybody think that if your bees die, then you're a horrible beekeeper? Is that how we all feel? Okay. Most people are agreeing, because otherwise then they'd be pointing fingers at themselves. If you keep bees, you will lose bees. And I mean, that is an unfortunate reality. But again, I think the part of the process and the goal of beekeeping is to improve that craft so that, you know, you lose fewer and fewer and fewer, right? But if you start out with the expectation that, you know, none of your bees are going to die, I just think that that's an unrealistic expectation. We need to temper that a little bit. And just realize that, you know, the bees can die for lots of different reasons, some of which could be your fault, and we can learn from those, but you can still do everything right, and yet still, you know, the bees can die. And so you need to stop blaming yourself unnecessarily, I guess. The Mecklenburg beekeepers say that they teach that in their beekeeping course. And yeah, okay, that's good, because I think that can soften the blow, you know, to those aspiring beekeepers who might fear that that's going to be problematic. Along with losing bees, if you're going to be a beekeeper, keep bees. Yes, pay attention to them, or you will lose more than normal. Yeah, exactly. I think that's the point. The second point is that we don't want to be complacent with 30 or, you know, however many losses. We don't want to be starting up new bees in the spring and just not worrying about them, have them all die, you know, every winter, and then starting up every year. That's not what we want, right? The aim is to minimize those losses, you know, as we go forward. Somebody in Montgomery made a good suggestion here, and that is leaving on more honey in the fall, so that they have a better chance of surviving the winter. That's very true. I think, you know, the old adage is that honeybee colonies don't freeze during the winter; they starve during the winter. So if beekeepers take off too much honey the summer or fall before, then they might not have as much honey stores to make it through the winter. So sometimes, you know, you need to be kind of conservative about how much you take off, because if you take off too much, you could be dooming the colony to, you know, to not making it through the winter. So those, again, are that balance is hard to say, because different winters last longer and are colder, so their honey stores vary from year to year, right? We can't predict how, you know, long and cold a winter it's going to be. Neither can the bees. It's just one of those things that you have to have that that sense over time about, you know, how much is too much. But that's a very good point. All right, I'll go on to the next point, and to Lewis's comment earlier, is that, you know, probably the #1 management concern are Varroa mites. For those of you that are new, they are these little parasitic mites that are visible to the naked eye, and they are public enemy #1. They are the issue, the #1 issue when it comes to bee management. Now, there's a lot of things in the press about, you know, problems of pesticides and problems of, you know, feeding bees and nutritional problems, and, you know, using the right type of hive and all these other things. Yes, there are many things that, you know, can go wrong when it comes to bee colonies. There's many stressors on our bees, but the first and foremost is this ubiquitous Varroa mite that it did not co-evolve with our honeybees, so it is an exotic introduced pest, and so our bees don't have the same arsenal of defenses that other bees have. And so they can be just really, really problematic for beekeepers. And so ignoring them you do so at your own risk. And you know, so many beekeepers do that, especially in their first year. Sometimes they're told that, well, first year colony, they don't really have mites, or if you don't see them, you don't have them, or you know, other things like that. There is some misinformation out there about them, but they are nefarious. They are really, they can be bad. Or they are really bad in many different ways, and so it is something that really all bee schools really need to emphasize, as Lewis was saying before. Another thing kind of tied to that is that a lot of the introductory bee schools are talking about all the different diseases. You know, there are a lot of diseases. Honeybees have a lot of diseases, many of which are, you know, economically important. But I think for an aspiring beekeeper, or for a beginning beekeeper, by talking so much about the bad things, it can be kind of off-putting to talk about kind of all the ways that bees can get sick. And, you know, so it can get kind of demoralizing if it's covered too much. But I think there's also another kind of downside, is that the Varroa mites can be swept up in this mass of all these other diseases, and it kind of gets lost at just how important they are compared to things like chalk brood and, you know, some other things that really, by and large, aren't all that important when it comes to colony health. It's at least not nearly as important as Varroa mites. So in our bees network, for example, we don't cover diseases at the beginner level. We have an advanced course completely devoted to parasites, pests, and pathogens. And we cover all of these, and we have a totally another advanced course on Varroa specifically. Okay, so we treat those as advanced topics. At the beginning level, I really cover, you know, things that as a beginner you need to look out for. You know, if you see this, just keep your eye on it, but it's not too much of a problem. If you see this, be vigilant, and, you know, you might want to, you know, go back and check on it again soon. If you see this, get help immediately. You know, so kind of very simple categories, and Varroa mite being, you know, one of them. And so, you know, I really think that that making that a priority from day one as you're aspiring to become a beekeeper will really help you in the long term for your bee management. I've always said that there are 3 necessary pieces of beekeeping equipment: the veil, the smoker, and the hive tool. I've now amended that to say that there's a 4th piece of beekeeping equipment that you need to have with you every single time that you go into the bee yard, and that's a sugar shake jar. Every single time you go into your bees, you should have your veil, you should have a lit smoker, your hive tool, and you should also do a sugar shake to see what your mites are. Knowing what your mite levels are at all times is just really, really critical, and it's something that we should be starting and addressing that starting day one for aspiring beekeepers. So does anybody disagree with that, or do you think that I'm giving that too much of a priority, or do you think that even mites are, you know, kind of more advanced and really something that aspiring beekeepers shouldn't be concerned with right away? One question, Jim had a question here for each hive overall. I would say each hive. Because it's actually pretty astounding that if you have a line of 10 hives, that the variance and the variation in the mite levels between those hives. One can just be rife with them, and the others can be, you know, relatively free of them. And that can change pretty quickly. So, you know, you really need to measure each hive, you know, preferably every time you go into it. That adds a lot of work. You know, I'm not saying that it's something that's really easily done, but if you get into that habit very early on, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it will absolutely improve your success as a beekeeper. The Chatham group here says it makes sense because if you try to cover all pests and diseases in 1 2-hour session of bee school, you only skim everything. And that's exactly right, and Varroa is the most important. So, you know, and again, teaching these bee schools, you have to make a lot of decisions because, again, we just have this mountain of information that, you know, we would love to be able to communicate. So you're constantly making decisions about what to include, what not to include. And, you know, so I just think that rather than trying the broad approach, you know, a mile wide, inch deep, I really think we ought to focus on the things that are critical, that are of concern, and those that are just, you know, not really going to be problematic. And I really think that that is probably a better way to address those potential problems, but might really being highlighted as, you know, something that needs to take precedence. Okay, I think the last piece of advice that I always give to starting beekeepers is that nobody is smarter than everybody. That as a group, we have far more experience and knowledge than we ever will have as an individual. And so getting plugged into the beekeeping community will save you time, it'll give you reassurance, it'll give you experience by proxy. It will help you get such a head start than doing it in a vacuum. Now, again, most of the bee schools are already, I mean, that goes without saying if somebody is, you know, joining one of the bee schools in the state or elsewhere. But a lot of times I think, too, that people come to these bee schools, but then they kind of drift off on their own and they don't stay plugged in to the group. And so maybe this is a good time to talk about those mentoring programs or those other things to try and keep people involved in that local beekeeping community so that they can assimilate you know, knowledge easier and faster than they would otherwise. Because there really is that benefit of learning from the experience and the failures of others so that you don't have to repeat those same failures yourselves and learn the hard way, right? I think if I can read into Debbie's or into the Chatham's comment about you know, the mentorship programs and everything, that, you know, with lots of new beekeepers, the most experienced beekeepers can get overburdened with lots and lots of questions, right? So this is the thing that we've noticed in talking about mentoring programs is, you know, how do we foster these mentorships without, you know, overburdening the mentors, but making sure that those aspiring beekeepers get that information that they're really looking for, right? So I'd love to hear some ideas of ways that different clubs or different individuals have overcome a lot of that communication issues and trying to match up mentors with mentees and things that worked, things that didn't.
Yeah.
Okay, Andrew, I think you can hit the talk button. Go ahead. No? Okay, well, Lewis writes here that it's hard, if not impossible, to find mentors when bee schools contain 75 to 100 students. Yeah, if you have 100 students and you have 2 people who are the mentors of the group, yeah, there's no way that they're gonna, you know, not become overburdened. Albemarle beekeepers have an open discussion when you meet once a month. Yes, so that's exactly my point here, is by getting plugged into that beekeeping community, rather than relying necessarily on the individuals, that, you know, you can learn from each other as a group, rather than, you know, those one-on-one interactions. But those one-on-one interactions are also very, very important, right? So it's a combination of those things. But in either way, getting plugged into that local chapter and that local group is really, really critical. The Mecklenburg group, they take new students and assign a mentor that may may not be experienced, but that mentor is plugged into a more experienced mentor. Perfect. This is exactly my idea that I also have been thinking about as far as kind of a tiered system. And in many ways, the Master Beekeeper programs across the nation are, you know, supposed to embody that in a certain way, where I'd like to say that, you know, a second-year beekeeper, they may not be a mentor in the same way that the guy that's been keeping bees for 20 years has been, right? But they still add value to that newcomer. They can still show that newcomer how to light a smoker, right? So that 20-year experienced beekeeper, she doesn't have to be not burdened, but she doesn't have to, she can spend her time answering the more difficult questions rather than teaching somebody how to light a smoker, right? So if there was a structure where, you know, one could not always burden the most experienced beekeeper, but rather the second or the fifth year beekeepers could still provide that mentorship to those that don't have as much experience, I think that is a really great way to kind of build in a little bit of a hierarchical system, if you would, but I think that would be a good way to have the beekeeping community where those that are just starting can get the benefit from all of the above without it always falling on the shoulders of the most experienced beekeeper or beekeepers in the group, right? Chatham County has a very active beekeeping listserv, yes, so communication is key, and email listservs can be a great way for that, right? And so that's a great way for new beekeepers to get advice. And they also do monthly field days, really monthly field days. That is astounding. That is really great. And I agree that by showing one beekeeper the same thing and then the next day having to show another beekeeper the same thing can really add up and be inefficient as far as the usage of time. So again, getting together as a community to show those things collectively, I think is a really very wise idea. It says that Orange County here has a private Google map where people map their location so others can find them. That's actually really cool. I didn't realize you could make anything private in Google. That's just a joke for all you techies. But on the map, people can enter their experience and willingness to help others. And that's really great. That's a really good idea, and you do it so that people can participate as they wish, right? But it still has that that way to find each other and to increase and foster that communication. So that's a great idea. I like that a lot. Montgomery Beekeeper suggested establishing a cost share program to help fund mentoring. Yep. This could be via grants or in conjunction with the NCSBA. So again, this was something kind of like what the Mecklenburg group was thinking about this tiered system. I was thinking that the Bees Network and having an online community could be a mechanism for that, where the mentees could pay into it, and the mentors then at different levels, different kind of hierarchies, could actually financially benefit from that. I think when you're dealing with that kind of thing, it shouldn't be done lightly. But it is something that I've been thinking about for a couple of years, and so I'm really glad to hear that others out there are thinking kind of the same things. So, Louis, you have your hand up, or did you?
Yes. Yes. I think we're talking about mentors. I think of mentors as a mentor is someone who has more experience than you, and I also want to encourage people to connect with what I call bee buddies. Somebody who has kind of the same experience as you, and so that you can look at each other's hives and discuss the differences, and I think that can be valuable as well. Certainly there's no substitute for a mentor and who can show you what's right and what's wrong in your colony. And I wish everyone in bee school could have a mentor, but I'm not sure there are enough to go around. Yeah. But I hope that new folks will seek them out and do their best.
Yeah, that's a great point of peer-to-peer communication as well. That's true. It doesn't necessarily always have to be with you know, somebody more experienced. That peer-to-peer sharing, if you're in the same boat and you're all learning at the same time, you know, that you're going to have different experiences, and so you can definitely cross-communicate and share that way. So that's, again, another good reason of having these group discussions and everything like that. But that's a good point. The beekeeping buddies, the bee buddies, is a really good idea as well. Andrew, you have your hand up?
I think you covered a lot of this. But one of the things we've done here is set up a teaching bee yard at the extension. And so we have regular time out there, often before our meetings or on Saturdays, where new beekeepers can come and help as we manage the bee yard and have lots of good hands-on experience throughout the summer with very experienced beekeepers.
Yeah, there is nothing that can substitute hands-on learning when it comes to beekeeping. That's obviously one of the failings of the online, you know, bees network, in the sense that it's by definition not hands-on. But you know, being able to see the bees in vivo, in action, is really, really critical. And in fact, Larry Connor, who writes a lot for the beekeeping trade magazines, and he does a lot of talks. He's come to North Carolina several times. He has a really nice metric that I like as well, which is he talks about the number of colony years that you have under your belt. So it's a metric of saying how many colonies of bees have you had and kept alive for 1 year. So if you've had one colony of bees that you've kept alive for 10 years, that would be 10 colony years. If you've kept 10 colonies alive for 1 year, that would be 10 colony years, right? But if you've kept 10 colonies and every single year they die off and you start out scratch, and you do that for 10 years, you have 0 colony years, right? You haven't kept it alive you haven't kept none of them alive for a year. So, you know, you can say, well, I've been keeping bees for 10 years, but it's like, yeah, but if they've died every year, then, you know, that's not very effective. So it's a way to not just express how long you've been keeping bees as a mentor, but also how successful you've been keeping bees. And I really like that inclusion of that metric. And so the only way that you can get that experience is, you know, doing it together or by successfully keeping those bees. So I really think that that's a very good point of, you know, lots of hands-on activities, and if you can do them as groups, all the better. Mecklenburg group is saying that one thing in their group is that some of the mentors encourage new beekeepers to set up their hives in the mentor's bee yard so that they can get more attention. That's actually a really good idea, because then anytime that the new beekeeper wants to go out and see their bees, they also have that resource right on hand, right? So if they have any questions that they, you know, can feel free to ask them. I think that's a really good idea, and it's very giving of the mentor beekeeper. Another comment here is that the first year is the hardest. Hooking up with any beekeeper with 1 year plus could be invaluable. So yes, that's absolutely true. That is really what we're talking about in this webinar here, is those aspiring beekeepers, right? Those who are going to start this year. What can we do this year to make that experience as positive as possible so that they can get through any of those difficulties and not give up in frustration, right? So, you know, mentoring and realizing that, you know, the bees can die and it's not necessarily their fault, and all of these different ideas, I think, all go hand in hand with that. But you're absolutely right. Yep. Another comment here is that letting novice beekeepers keep the hives at the club yard. So yeah, again, either in the mentor's yard or in some communal yard where they can, again, learn from each other in a peer way or in a mentoring way. Again, all very, very helpful. So those are all really great ideas, and I'm really pleased to see them put to practice, you know, in many different ways to solve the same solution. But it really does, you know, seem to me that there's a real need out there, perhaps for something more formalized or something that has some inputs to it. And so, again, you know, I've really been thinking along these lines. I think it would take a lot of work, and so it probably would take a lot of inputs. But I still think that because so many beekeepers are in need of it, I think it's definitely worth exploring. So before we wrap up here, then I just want to see, you know, what I've missed. What are some other things that other people that we haven't discussed this evening that you think are really critically important? Mark, go ahead.
I might be on a slow internet connection. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. Go right ahead.
All right. I don't have my bees yet, but I was looking at buying some overwintered hives. Some of the beekeepers I know have had 2 hives for years and years, but everything that I'm looking at tells me that I should, I may be needing some more equipment right off of that. So if I'm paying attention to the bees, trying to grow them, watching for signs of swarming, performing splits and such as that, if I start out with 2 good overwintered hives, it would seem to me that I might need to consider doubling the amount of equipment that I start out with. Would you say that, or at least if I start out with 2 hives, at least having 1 more hive and some extra super?
So that's a good point. That this is something that I always recommend is start with multiple hives. Have at least 2 colonies, because that will give you at least the minimum frame of reference of comparison. If you have 1 hive and you look at it and you're like, well, I don't know if that's doing good or bad, right? If you're doing it in a vacuum and you're not taking advantage of these field days or these other things that we've been talking about, if you're just looking at 1 hive, then it's kind of difficult to know whether it's doing well. But if you have 2, at least you can say, well, that one's doing better than that one, right? Or that one's doing a lot better than that one. And then it gives you a little bit of relativity, right? So again, seeing lots of bees with others or on your own, I definitely think starting out with 2 hives helps. Now, starting with, rather than from packages, but starting with established hives or splits, as you mentioned, can help success. I think they're a lot more forgiving, and they're kind of less likely to fail for beginner beekeepers. So that's another thing that that I think a lot of bee schools and a lot of beekeepers, at least in North Carolina, have been moving towards. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that, and good luck if you haven't started your bees yet, but I hope this has really helped, because you're exactly who we're hoping to help here. Sorry, I've gotten behind on some of these chats. It says, feel that beginning beekeepers move too fast in getting their bees. Why not encourage new students to wait 1 year, take the school, work with a mentor, his or her hives, and then set up your own hives? Absolutely. That's actually a great point, in the sense that you shouldn't feel compelled if you take the bee school this year that by the end of that bee school you're going to have your own hives. Now, I think that's a good goal to have for the bee school, that graduates of that school should feel ready to do that, but they shouldn't feel compelled to do it. I think there's a distinction there, and I think that's what you're bringing up, is that, you know, you can ease into it, you know, get your experience first before you start up your own, and do that in your 2nd year. I think that would definitely improve success. In fact, I'd love to see a study done of those who started their 1st year in a total vacuum, those who started their 1st year from a bee school, and those that started their second year after attending bee school, and see what the success rate of those types of individuals would be, I bet you'd see an increase in success linearly there. Mecklenburg says, a member there said, after 13 years of keeping bees, come to realize that I am practicing like a lawyer practices law and a doctor practices medicine. And that's exactly right. It's incredibly complex, and there's an art form to it. And that's exactly right. There's very little rules that are absolute when it comes to bees and beekeeping. And again, that's something that we really, a lot of us are really fond of when it comes to bees, but it can also be incredibly maddening. So for aspiring beekeepers, knowing that that's what they're getting into, I think is important. Andrew, you have your hand up?
Yes, David, can you hear me? Good.
Yes.
One of the things that I've seen in a couple of bee schools, we talk about the need to feed the package or feed the nuke or feed our bees, and we don't tell some of them when to stop feeding the bees until you get a new beekeeper that comes up and says, honey tastes like honeybee healthy, and you realize you've been feeding completely through the honey flow. We need to, I think as mentors or as teaching the bee school, we need to put a little more emphasis on when is the right time to feed and when should we not be feeding bees.
That's a great point. As far as, you know, and that's another example of, well, the book tells you to do this when, right? But it's not taking into account all the unique variables of your particular location, right? If you're setting up packages in the middle of a nectar flow, then you probably don't need to feed, right? You don't need to feed supplementally, right? And, you know, when to put the emphasis on the nutrition. So again, mentoring can help that, and, you know, more experience can help that. But you're absolutely right, is just by following the recipe is that's where you can get in trouble. But going back to the biology and understanding the whole system, that's where that type of thing can help. So yeah, I absolutely agree that a lot of beginning beekeepers may not understand those subtle nuances, but that's something that we really do need to try to communicate, obviously. But doing so, that's really a lesson in the biology and the ecology of the bees, of that particular issue of dealing with nutrition. Another question here, should we suggest that people need to learn about bees before getting into bees? Yes. Don't get the bees first and then try to learn all about them. Yeah. Actually, that's probably a fourth group that would be wonderful to test. You're absolutely right that I think, in fact, I think that would probably be kind of far and few between. That would be really, that would be pretty brave of somebody, I think, to go out and buy some bees, and as they're sitting on their kitchen counter, they decide to crack open a book and say, what do I do with them now? That would be, you know, pretty brave, I would think. But you're absolutely right that there is a lot to understand first before you get into it. And to that point about perhaps even starting your second year and not feeling compelled or rushed into things, it's a really good idea. To that point, it's like take to school, start a hive or two, and then take the class again. Yeah, in fact, I think that's actually pretty common. How about a quick show of hands for those of you that are tuning in here? Quick show of hands for how many people, you know, went to your local bee school even though you already took it the year before, or you've already started a hive of bees and you were kind of beyond a beginner, but you still learned something from that beginner school. I sure do. I mean, it's pretty common, right? I think a lot of us can relate to the fact that even a beginner bee school where you're covering the same information just through the discussion or through a new presenter of the same material, you know, you can very easily learn something new. So don't think that bee school is always just for beginners. Another thing, though, too, that I think is really missing in a lot of our local clubs are bee schools for advanced beekeepers, or, you know, not just the beginner schools, but, you know, more advanced content. You know, that's something that I think there's a real paucity of that. There's such a bottom-heavy emphasis on, you know, getting new beekeepers and getting them started, but there's not a lot for those 5-year beekeepers out there. And so I think, you know, we need more resources like that to try and foster beekeepers that have hit and plateaued at a certain level and they really feel like they need additional growth. So I just realized that I asked everybody to raise their hands, and so if you had a question, I'm afraid I'm going to be lowering your hand again. But I also realized that it is 8:15, and this has been going on for over an hour now. So what I think I'll do is thank Chatham County Beekeepers again for hosting this virtually, and for the Pitt, Montgomery, and Mecklenburg group for joining this evening. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, but we don't necessarily have to give up the discussion. But thanks again for hosting.